Joining me, I'm thrilled to welcome three experts onto the call. So first off, Oludamilare Adesola, who is an Associate Director based in Nigeria, who leads on our West Africa risk consulting practice. Also joining us is Vincent Rouget, who is a Principal and Head of our Africa Geopolitical Risk Consulting practice. And last but no means least, we have Claudine Fry on the screen here, who is the partner who leads our global issues team out of London. Just briefly from me, for those of you who aren't aware, RiskMap is Control Risks' annual publication that provides what we feel is an unparalleled thought leadership and an analysis into the global risk landscape, which encompasses a composite of political, security, regulatory, operational, cyber, and ESG related risk factors. And what we do is we monitor and rate each risk and reflect this in our risk map, which I think is, you can see on the screen in front of you, but also informs what we call our top 5 risks that we feel are going to impact businesses globally. With our clients, we've seen RiskMap become a really important tool to our clients globally, noting the impact that risk has on strategy, on investments, market development, and projects alike. And we spend an awful lot of our time advising boards and management teams around exactly some of these issues as well. I think also it's something that has become acutely important for those investing in or operating across the African continent. Just over the last few years, we've seen geopolitics and macroeconomic global events cast a much greater shadow and a darker shadow on business activity across the African continent. You only have to look at the Ukraine conflict and its impact on food security and inflation. We've got China-US trade wars that are impacting critical minerals activity across the continent. And of course, you've got the unprecedented impact of US interest rates that have really heavily impacted African economies in the last few years. So with that context and brief overview, in terms of today's running order, Claudine Fry will kick things off with an overview as to the top 5 global risks. And then we'll turn to Oludamilare and Vincent, who will discuss how we see these various issues playing out across the African landscape. And then we'll just close with some Q&A from those on the call. So please do submit those through the Q&A button on the platform. As ever, on these calls, there's an awful lot to cover through. And if you do want more information on anything that we've discussed, or there's aspects that you feel we haven't quite had the time to cover or address sufficiently on the call, then very happy to engage with you separately or one-on-one. But with that, Claudine, let me pass over to you for our top 5 risks.
Thank you very much, Tom. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be with you today and have an opportunity to share our top risks. Vincent's just showing you on the map there. He's in charge of the slide deck today, the map that we have that goes with our RiskMap campaign. And I thoroughly encourage you to all have a good look at that in your own time. It's available on our website and it tells many, many stories. What we're going to do is today run through the top 5 risks that sit alongside this map. Vincent, if you could just go along to the next slide, please, that would be wonderful. And we'll do the big reveal. Our top 5 risks for 2025 are uncertain states of America, global trade war, rising political violence, supply chain concentration risk, and red line geopolitics. And I want to say up front that we came up with these risks before the 5th of November, before we knew that Donald Trump was going to be re-entering the White House for a second term. And the reason I want to make that very clear is that I think we're all grappling with the consequences of Trump winning that election and indeed winning it so convincingly. And I think certainly it's a hugely consequential moment for the world. There's no question about that. But I also think it's important that we don't overstate the consequences of that election win, because actually there are many, many trends in play and drivers of macro risks, which were in play regardless of Trump winning the US election, and we saw as being in going in certain directions and as being in play regardless of whether we had Kamala Harris or Donald Trump in the White House from early 2025. So yes, a hugely consequential moment for the world, and it sometimes does feel as if we're standing on the edge of a precipice at the moment. But on the other hand, I think we need to stay focused on the underlying trends that are changing the business environment and the world around us, and recognize what is actually not changing as a consequence of Trump re-entering the White House. So I just want to make that very, very clear up front. I will also say that I think I've been doing these risk map campaigns for many, many years now, and there always seems to be one word that sums up the campaign, it sums up the year ahead. And we have to really make sure that we don't overuse it. We've had a lot of complexity, for example, in recent years, or fragility. Turbulence is another one. I think this year, and you may have your own suggestions and feel free to share them in the chat if you like, the word that sums up 2025 so far for us is unpredictable. It really is an exceptionally unpredictable moment of history, I think. And of course, that's partly linked to Trump, but it's linked to other factors too. So bear that in mind as well when we're thinking about these top risks today. So let's get underway in unpacking what we're actually thinking about here with respect to these top five. So the first one is the uncertain states of America. And again, just reiterating that this is very much about acknowledging that the US as a global superpower, it's declining. Its authority is declining globally. And that's very much something that's a long-term trend that is in play and was in play regardless of who won this US presidential election. Now, that's partly a consequence of what's happening around the world outside the US. There are a huge number of countries which are emerging on the global stage, which are increasingly significant as a consequence of demographics, location, natural resources, strategic interests, that are keen to play and have a right to play a much more prominent role in international organizations, in negotiations about finding solutions to international problems and so on. Many of them are in Africa, to think of South Africa, Nigeria, and in North Africa, countries like Egypt as well, to name just a few. So it's partly about recognizing that there are challenges to the supremacy and authority of the US that come simply because the world is changing. You could argue it's perhaps right-sizing. But there are other trends in play around the declining status of the US as a superpower, which are about what's happening within the US as well. And that's partly about the foreign policy choices and the democratic dysfunction that we've seen in the US in recent years, which is undermining the power of the soft power of the US, if you like. There's also the fact that we have a ballooning budget deficit in the US, which there doesn't seem to be any particular appetite or intent to tackle by any of the prominent politicians across the spectrum in Washington, which is undermining the authority of the US. And there's also evidence that there is less intent and appetite, and again, this applies to Democrats and Republicans, there's less appetite and intent for actually being engaged globally and overseas, and in projecting US might, and in going all out to promote and protect US values and interests overseas. So there are a number of different factors in play declining US authority, and what we see happening with Trump is essentially an acceleration of these trends. Trump does inject a degree of aggression, certainly some unpredictably, but probably some momentum behind some of these trends. So we expect to see, for example, Trump withdrawing troops from overseas, if not outright withdrawing from international organizations and bodies such as NATO, certainly operating in such a way within them that is ultimately undermining their effectiveness and cohesion, and essentially being meddlesome. So that's our first risk, thinking about the ripple effects globally of a more uncertain and less coherent United States of America. Our second top risk is global trade war. Now, I should say, first of all, that we are of the view that we already have the US and China locked in a trade war. This risk is very much about thinking what happens when that intensifies but also widens dramatically to incorporate the use of protectionism and trade controls by much more states around the world. This is partly about scale. Now, it is, of course, the US-China relationship is by far and away the most important driver of geopolitical risk and the most important factor around the extent to which a global trade war accelerates, intensifies, and grows in scale across 2025. This is partly about how the US and China behave. We've already seen over the past 24 hours that Trump has moved to impose tariffs on goods from Canada, Mexico, and China, actually not as punitive as we were maybe expecting, but he's nonetheless signaling his intent to follow through on some of the rhetoric that was common throughout his election campaign, that he would ramp up restrictions on perceived adversaries and trading partners around the world to protect US interests. And we certainly expect more of that. This is also about thinking about how China might respond. China's actually been pretty restrained so far in terms of how it's responded to pressure from the US on trade and investment restrictions, but it's flexing its muscles. It's got plenty of tools ready to go in its toolkit. And so we expect China to be ready to go a bit more forceful in terms of how it uses restrictions on trade and sanctions to protect its own interests and respond to what it sees as threats and unreasonable behavior on the part of the US. But as I said, this is a global story. This is not just about the US and China. There were 3,000 restrictions on trade introduced globally in 2023. That is 5 times the amount that were introduced in 2015. So protectionism is very much in fashion right around the world. Global trade is increasingly fragmented. You can see on this graphic here on the right of the slide on your screen that we're starting to see trade and investment flow along geopolitical lines, and I think that will continue. At the moment, we are seeing actually global trade is forecast to grow by around 3% next year, but we are nonetheless starting to see it fragment, and growth in trade is actually restricted to just certain parts of the globe at the moment, and it's particularly in Asia. South-South trade fell actually 5% when you're comparing the first quarter of 2024 with the first quarter of 2023. So ultimately, it's a global trade picture which is very fragmented. We're seeing trading relationships being rethought, reimagined. Sometimes that's intentionally, sometimes that's because they're forced into a reimagining. And ultimately, this all has an inflationary effect on us all. Thank you, Vincent. So moving on to our third top risk for 2025. This is about political violence. Political violence, I think, is something which is increasingly every day. We're thinking really here about the normalization of the weaponization of politics, and it's in play in lots of different ways in different parts of the world. This is driven, of course, partly by geopolitical rivalry, political polarization, online radicalization, and the way that emerging technologies are being used by all kinds of threat actors, from the most extreme to some of the more comparatively benign as well. There's a few different types of political violence that we think you should have on your radars for 2025. One of them is Islamist extremism, which is a bit of an issue it's never far from our minds, but I think it's fallen off being as prominent as it was a number of decades ago. But I think it's really important that we keep Islamist extremism at the forefront of our minds, particularly in the context of this geopolitical environment in which there are conflicts at play and environments where state authority is in question, where there is essentially an opportunity for extremist groups to operate and gain strength. We know that there are groups affiliated with both IS, Islamic State, and Al-Qaeda, for example, throughout the Sahel, exploiting local grievances and filling voids. We know that we might have a withdrawal of US troops from Iraq and other parts of the Middle East, which will undermine the effectiveness of counterterrorism operations against, for example, Islamic State across Iraq and Syria. And I think worth also bearing in mind that the situation in the Middle East remains extremely precarious, and what's going on in Gaza, in Lebanon, in other parts of the region that's linked back to Israel is fostering radicalization and a whole new generation of individuals who may be radicalized both within the region and beyond. Another type of political violence to have on your minds in particular, I think, is state-sponsored attacks. So we've seen a taboo around assassination and the use of that as a tactic, I think that's breaking down. And when you mention this issue, people often think that we're just talking about the US off the back of 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump during the US election campaign. But actually, it's more global than you might imagine. We've had really serious attempted assassinations on prominent politicians right across the world, from Argentina, Brazil, Japan, Slovakia, Denmark, the UK, and Pakistan, just to name a few countries within the last 5 years. So there is a sort of normalization of this sort of use of targeted violence. And in a less extreme fashion, we have also had a number of different incidents of non-attributable incidents that are probably linked back to states targeting critical national infrastructure, particularly here in Europe, which suggests that states are asserting themselves in ways that are potentially escalatory, even if not intentionally so. Thank you, Vincent. So moving on to our 4th top risk. Here we are thinking about the concentration that we have on a small number of suppliers in our supply chains, and particularly when we're thinking about our tech, our digital supply chains. There is a reliance across the board, right across the private sector and into state organizations as well. There is an extraordinary reliance on a very, very small number of providers for things like cloud services. And we saw with the CrowdStrike incident this year how phenomenally disruptive, as in that case, it was actually just an accident caused when an update to a system went very badly wrong. But we saw how devastating that could be. And what we're thinking about with this risk, as it applies to next year, is the possibility of some form of disruption to a piece of software that could potentially be perpetrated maliciously and intentionally, just how catastrophic that could be for systems potentially globally and enormously costly. So we are all incredibly vulnerable to malicious damage of tech. We know that threat actors are well aware of this. They're as aware of this as we all should be. And so there are targets which are very high impact and actually relatively easy to target by threat actors who are sophisticated, but also, frankly, those who are not necessarily so sophisticated as well. And we also know that states are increasingly emboldened to act, and sometimes perhaps even without using anonymous proxies. So we're thinking here about the danger of state-linked or non-state-linked actors acting in ways that undermine our supply chains and our digital integrity, and how very vulnerable we are because of that concentration on just a handful of suppliers. Okay, our final top risk is linked to this sense of anarchy on the global stage, which links very much to what I was just mentioning around the type of state activity, state-linked activity we might see targeting digital infrastructure. It also links to what I was saying about state-sponsored attacks outside in other countries or to target perceived adversaries. We are living in an environment where there is a degree of anarchy, where red lines are being reimagined, rethought, they're being crossed. There is a sense of rules, the rules are being rewritten, essentially, on the global stage. Generally speaking, political leaders tend to calibrate their actions from a foreign policy perspective very, very carefully to avoid escalation. And we see that even in global flashpoints that we're all relatively familiar with, in the South China Sea, for example, or in the Middle East. But in this context where red lines are so uncertain, there is a very, very, very real danger of miscalculation, even if there is also a danger of red lines being perceived very differently on different sides of geopolitical divides as well. Thinking, for example, of South Africa and the positioning that South Africa has taken on Israel and Russia Putin over the past few years, and how that has been perceived in Europe and in the US as potentially crossing a red line. There are these issues around what's perceived as a red line potentially being contradictory as well. So there's a number of different parts of the world where we're watching very, very closely to see where there could be flare-ups of violence or tension, even if unintentionally so. In Asia, this very much relates to tension between China and the Philippines and the South China Sea, as well as relating to Taiwan. In the Middle East, we are watching very closely to see how far Israel might go to annex the West Bank and Gaza, for example. And in Europe, all eyes are on Russia and whether it might, for example, make tactical use of a nuclear weapon. So a number of different wild cards, if you like, which in the current very unpredictable environment, we need to treat seriously. So all in, essentially an environment where we have some very traditional sources of risk around the sort of depressed macroeconomic environment, the inflationary effect of trade war, layered on top a degree of global anarchy in the geopolitical system. Very much looking forward to hearing how this plays out in Africa. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Claudine. Massively insightful as ever, and a really helpful and I think thought-provoking scene setter to the next segment. Just before we go to that, just again to remind, there's a section at the bottom of the platform just to submit through your questions, and we'll aim to answer those at the end of the session. I see we've had a couple of questions through already. But now I think let's dig a little closer into the region and discuss how those sort of top 5 risks and those global themes are really going to play out and impact Africa. And perhaps Vincent and Dami, if you'd like to put your cameras on. Vincent, maybe starting with you around the sort of first topic that Claudine had presented, around sort of Trump and his victory in the US presidential elections, and really that sort of uncertainty that it brings around the US engagement with the rest of the world. I guess the question being, how do we see that Trump presidency, that Trump 2.0 playing out across Africa? I think noting that in his first term, it barely featured at all. But Vincent, maybe to you for that.
Sure, thanks, Tom. And I think, Claudine set the scene perfectly when she said that US engagement with the rest of the world was already evolving prior to Trump coming back to the White House. And that's the case for Africa as well. Yes, in the last year or two, we did see a little bit more activism on the part of the Biden administration vis-a-vis Africa, but overall, there has been a trend of relative disengagement for the last 10 to 15 years towards the continent. And the return of Trump to the White House will accelerate rather than completely shift the dial on this matter. We know, as you said, that Africa barely featured in Trump's world map between 2017 and 2020. That's very likely to be the case again this time around. That doesn't mean that there will be no Africa policy whatsoever. What it does mean is that policy will be sent or will be dictated much lower levels of the administration by a group of advisors in state, the national security team that he will appoint that will have quite an outsized influence in shaping that policy. Now, when it comes to what the policy or what the main pillars of that policy will look like towards Africa, what we can say for certain is that there will be a strong element of countering China's influence. That was the key pillar of Trump's first term towards Africa, the lens of great power competition. And we saw, if anything, the Biden and Harris administration largely continue along that line, maybe slightly less overtly. We know that a lot of the recent cabinet appointment of Trump points to a very hawkish foreign policy towards China. And so we see Africa being a bit of a battlefield where that will play out. That means that some of the initiatives that were launched under Biden with that explicit intent of countering China will likely continue. One of them, probably the most flagship, being the Lobito corridor through Angola, Zambia, DRC, as a way of redirecting critical minerals away from China and towards the West. On the other hand, what we are also pretty certain is that the disengagement of the US from security issues in the region will continue. There's clearly no desire whatsoever on the Trump administration to have very heavy security counterterrorism footprint with troops on ground. If anything, we are moving towards less security cooperation and probably more business and more investment-focused cooperation. We should remember that it was under Trump's first term that the Development Finance Corporation, DFC, was set up. And we can imagine that this will continue, possibly again with a greater emphasis on using US development finance to counter the influence of China in the region. And we know there are concerns among some Chinese businesses that there could be new restrictions imposed by DFC on projects that would use Chinese equipment or any kind of Chinese involvement more broadly. Where there is scope for uncertainty is on the more transactional nature of US policy in the region. And we've gotten some hints from some of Trump's Africa advisors that they will be looking for reliable, capable partners and also for an element of reciprocity. What that means is it's probably relatively good news for the likes of Kenya that have strengthened relations with the US in the last few years. Where there is a potential for real disruption is in South Africa, where we believe, as Claudine alluded to, that the positioning that South Africa has taken towards the Israel-Gaza conflict, for example, could really damage relations with the Trump administration at the time where South Africa is preparing to take over the presidency of the G20 next year. There is also a little bit of uncertainty around the Horn of Africa region, for the main reason that some elements around Trump have advocated for the US to recognize Somaliland as an independent state and move away from the partnerships with Somalia. Now, any moves like this obviously will not be imminent, but that has the potential for a pretty significant reshaping of this Horn region that is already caught up in a lot of geopolitical tensions.
Thanks, Vincent. And maybe, Dami, turning to you, I'll look forward to seeing you in Nigeria next week for our RiskMap Lagos. But for you, sat on the ground in Nigeria, I guess sort of how was Trump's victory received on the ground, and what are some of the impacts that we can expect to see from that US-Nigeria relationship and perhaps across West Africa more broadly?
Yes, looking forward to seeing you too, Tom, next week. So the reaction to Trump's victory in Nigeria has been a bit mixed. I think, first of all, there was a lot of misinformation during the campaign season because a lot of the popular media outlets that we have here are left-leaning when they cover US politics. So really, I think where a lot of the public is just trying to fact-check a lot of some of the points of public debates and trying to understand what a Trump-led government would actually mean for Nigeria and the broader West African region. So for instance, you briefly touched on that when it comes to immigration and the rumors that were circulating about Trump clamping down on all immigration and tourism, both legal and illegal. But if you look at the facts, it's actually the Biden administration that faced criticism for extending visa timelines, reducing the number of available appointments in Nigeria, and that ultimately impacted the number of visas that were issued. But we've already expressed the Trump administration, so I think at Control Risks, we're not anticipating too many surprises. But like Vincent alluded to, Trump's approach to foreign policy, especially in Africa, will be transactional and focused on an America First mentality. And that would mean less interference from the US when it comes to democracy, pushing, democratic ideals, governance reforms in Nigeria and the surrounding regions. Specifically, when we look at ECOWAS and much of Francophone West Africa, we've seen a decline in US influence, broadly more about Western influence with pushback from French influence, but that has also then impacted the US role in this region. And so a notable example is earlier in the year, Niger, the transitional government in Niger ordered the evacuation of US military bases and said that they were annulling the military agreement. And it's useful to note that that base is the largest in the region and has been key to the fight against ISIL. And so we expect that decline in US influence to continue in West Africa. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea would continue to push back against the West. But I also want to note that there's a chance that we could also see a shift in how the US engages with countries like this, because Trump has been known to be a little more effective than other presidents when it comes to dealing with difficult leaders and negotiating with regimes that are resistant to Western pressure. So we could see him being more pragmatic and less ideological in his approach when he's dealing with military juntas. But again, it will be for cases that are important to the U.S. and to the stability or the progress of U.S. ideals, and when it comes to addressing or deciding which of these conversations we prioritize. Another point to consider is maybe when it comes to broader conversations about human rights, specifically the LGBTQ community. Many West African countries have laws that are hostile to these communities, and under the Biden administration, there were a few, public statements that were put out that we're seeing as an attempt to pressurize a change in the laws of this government, and often sometimes with the underlying conversation about that being tied to continued aid and support. But now with a conservative president like Trump, we don't expect that this pressure will continue, and that could result in more relaxed approach to the US-West Africa relations in this regard. But overall, I think that we expect to see a more disengaged US policy in West Africa, focusing more on bilateral engagements, pragmatic negotiations, and less pressure on human rights and governance reforms.
Thanks, Dami. Really, really useful and interesting perspective from on the ground there. I guess you're maybe sticking with you. So one of the other sort of topics that Claudine had referenced through was this notion of a sort of global trade war. I guess just interested again how you see this trickling down to the African continent, noting that presumably this will represent challenges, it will represent risks, but clearly also there's upside opportunity as well. So yeah, perhaps interested from you, Dami, and then Vincent as well.
Yes, like you mentioned, the impact is expected to be twofold, but there's a saying over here that when elephants fight, it's the ground that feels the impact. And in this context, Africa is very much that ground. Africa remains heavily reliant on imports and exports to these countries. I mean, we know that Africa exports outside of Africa than it does within Africa. And so the fallout from these trade wars between the US and China will have ripple effect on the continent. On one hand, there will be disruptions to global supply chains, whether it's delays in shipment, increases in tariffs, shortages of raw materials, and that could potentially hit African markets really hard. And affecting obviously the availability of essential goods, staple foods. We saw with some of the issues with Russia and Ukraine, one how that affected wheat and trickled down to bread, which is a staple food, and pushing up the local production of some of these goods, because we're very much dependent on imports for inputs, and again leading the impact that could have on inflation and socioeconomic conditions and business operations. It could be tremendous. But on the other hand, these trade disruptions could present new opportunities. As supply chains get restructured, there's a potential for increased demand for African exports, especially for countries who are looking for alternatives to traditional suppliers. And this could open up new trade markets, present opportunity for Africa to diversify some trade relationships and grow its economy, and also even boosting intra-African trade. We have the AFTA agreement, and that has been moving on. Nigeria, entered into a recent agreement with Kenya under that, and so there's a lot of potential there. And so we could see regional players turning to each other for the supply of goods and services and creating a more interconnected Africa. At the same time, there's also a mini scramble for Africa going on, where global leaders, the US, China, and I'll also throw Russia into that mix, are increasingly courting African countries to strengthen their global influence. We saw with, I talked about ECOWAS countries moving to push out France from the region and turning to China and to Russia, pardon me, for support with military and security partnerships, while the US continues to be focused on aid and investments in sectors like health, education, tech. And China continues to lead when it comes to infrastructure development and loans. I mean, we all know how Chinese loans are viewed over here, but China is also taking steps to sort of restructure, not seen as a loan shark, to see how we can restructure so they can continue to remain the preferred loan provider especially when it comes to infrastructure projects. So for smaller countries, there's a need to align and pick a side for competition, for influence. But larger countries like Nigeria have the luxury of sitting on the fence. So we are able to maintain strong bilateral relationships with all sides, giving us some sort of leverage when it comes to how we can benefit from all of these relationships without being committed to anyone. So again, the global trade war creates challenges, but it also presents opportunities to diversify relationships and capitalize on the different shifts that we are seeing in the global dynamics.
And Tom, maybe just to build on the other aspect of the trade war topic that Claudine mentioned is this rise of protectionism that we're seeing around the world. One element or one sector where it's particularly visible in Africa at the moment is the natural resources sector, and we've published a report just in the last few days where we've observed 14 different countries just in the last year that have revised their policies or their legislation in the natural resources space towards greater nationalism and towards a greater government take on these countries that reflects the two factors that Dami and Claudine mentioned. One is the scramble for the region and the feeling from the part of government that there are ways that they could play off this to their advantage and do better out of that competition, particularly for natural resources. And the second one is just a more general trend that we are living in a more protectionist environment, where the kind of clearest indication happens around the capture or the element of the level of take that governments take from mining and oil and gas in particular. Some of this has been kind of following a fairly standard legislative playbook, revising mining legislation through the process. Others, and particularly in the Sahel, has been a little bit more aggressive. And we've probably seen, and I'm sure some people on the line will have seen, some of the more radical, drastic moves that the governments of Mali and Burkina Faso in particular have made to extract better terms out of the industry, and the mining industry in particular. So there are places where this will create some jitters, but just generally speaking, we are seeing a trend towards greater local content, greater imperative for local transformation of resources, for example, and that, regardless of where we are in the region, will continue and intensify.
Thanks, Vincent. And maybe just sort of shifting gears slightly to the sort of notion of increased conflict and sort of political violence and instability. If you look at the map in front of us, where do you see some of those conflict hotspots? And I guess the degree to which we now have, how does that change now that we've got a US government that's a lot less interested in sort of resolving conflicts and sort of playing the role of sort of global or regional policemen in that regard, as Claudine had alluded to.
Yeah. So the data paints a fairly bleak picture. If we look at the last 5 years, what we've recorded is about a 60% increase in the number of fatalities from armed conflict in the region. We have to take these numbers with a bit of caution. We're also in an era where reporting on conflict has massively improved because of digital penetration. So it could be that we're just getting better data where there wasn't data before, but there are a few other indicators, for example, displaced communities and so on, that don't lie and that point to the same direction, that yes, there has been an increase in political violence, in conflict. where that's been the most pronounced is, in a way, if you draw a line from Mali to the Horn of Africa, so the kind of climatic zone of the Sahel, rather than just the countries that are commonly known as the Sahel. This is where we have by far the greatest incidence of conflict, really intractable situations, whether we're looking at the Mali-Niger-Burkina border region, the conflict in Sudan, and a bit further east as well into Ethiopia. This is by far the greatest concentration of political violence in the region. Other areas of conflict are more smaller, localized pockets like you see in the north of Mozambique or in the east of Congo. For those, unfortunately, that means that we are more and more heading towards a little bit of a two-track region. The argument's been made on the economic side to say that, there have been some economies that have barely grown in the last 10 years, while some others have been a lot more dynamic. It is also true on the security front, where we have a relatively stable western coast, eastern coast, and southern region. And as I said, this east to west Sahelian band, where unfortunately there is a bit of a fragility trap, where instability has deterred investment, which in turn bring higher levels of deprivation. And this is probably a focus, or this is getting more and more of a focus for the development finance community, but even they are facing difficulties in addressing this. Does the US election change much to that outlook? Not necessarily very much. We've already seen a trend the last few years where a lot of that conflict resolution work has been outsourced to regional partners. So if you look at the conflict in Eastern DRC, it is Angola who is leading the mediation. If you look at Sudan, there's a big effort in Saudi to address that conflict. If you look at the insurgency in northern Mozambique, it is mainly Rwandan troops that are helping to stabilize the region. So already there was a regionalization of these conflict resolution. What perhaps could create a bit of disruption in the short term is the US, we know, has still been playing a big role behind the scenes, whether it's through intelligence sharing or through discrete pressure. And we're always a bit careful with these transition moments, that if that pressure goes, potentially that leaves a bigger room for escalation, at least in the short term. But in the longer term, we see very much African conflicts being resolved by mostly regional actors rather than much direct US intervention.
Great, thanks, thanks, Vincent. And maybe just to pick up on another one of the sort of risks around this notion of digital concentration. Dami, just conscious on time, so briefly from you, we're increasingly involved in cyber and digital risk related work. Again, sort of how do you see that risk an issue playing out across the continent?
So Africa's digital infrastructure is much far from where it needs to be, but there are some positive developments happening, and it's expanding at an encouraging pace. So there was a cable cut. There was an issue with one of the cable cuts that led to a major internet outage early in the year. But actually, shortly before that, there was the 2Africa cable, which is being sponsored by MTN, Meta, and several other private telecoms company, had just reached Lagos, and that story was overshadowed by that. And but it's still a step forward in strengthening digital infrastructure, but it also highlights how vulnerable the systems can be. But also one of the threats to expanding and maintaining infrastructure is actually the socioeconomic issues that many African countries are facing, with the ongoing economic crisis and weak private consumption. It then begs the question of how profitable such large-scale projects can be and whether they should be prioritized. And so then the financial strain makes it harder to attract investment and sustain these long-term projects that are needed for the continued expansion of Africa's digital infrastructure. But there's also the issue of maintaining and protecting the infrastructure. So because of the implications for the interruptions and how they could impact businesses. So there was one, I think when that one happened, there was, the banking system is so reliant on that. So no one could make payments for a couple of days, no one could do transfers. and you can only imagine what the implication for businesses would be. So there is an urgent need, and I think this has been identified by some governments. Although that sector remains, it's a private sector, so it's really private investments that are needed for surveillance, for maintenance, for investments into expansion, but also just creating that positive policy environment is becoming a top priority for different governments for boosting their digital infrastructure going forward. So I think that's definitely a positive trend to note.
Thanks, Dami. And just conscious on time, and as ever, we want to have a little bit of positivity to the conversation as well. So perhaps, Vincent, Claudine sort of painted this picture of a much more fragmented, much more sort of confrontational world. Where do you see some of the bright spots in terms of countries, in terms of industries, or sectors? And then we'll go to Q&A.
Great, sure. I mean, we've recently released our Africa Risk Reward Index, and it did flag a few countries where we saw a positive improvement, i.e. a greater reward opportunity score. One of them was Mozambique. That might not seem necessarily the first country to flag given the current post-election disruption, but we think this will eventually peter out, and the fundamentals with the likely resumption of the energy projects are in a good place. We have a few countries, Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, Angola among them, that are now seeing more sustained growth and a real sense of opportunity there. And then probably the most interesting of all to flag would be South Africa, where there's a real sense of optimism and renewed goodwill among investors on the back of the elections, a sense of positive emulation within the government, and also a window of opportunity coming up this year, next year in 2025 with the presidency of the G20. That starts officially on the 1st of December, so next week, and we'll have a whole series of events, diplomatic, business, and the likes, culminating in the G20 summit in Johannesburg in November of next year. That is a hugely important moment for South Africa, but the continent more broadly, to elevate its voice, to make it on the global stage and to push some of the issues that they've long been advocated for, whether it's on the sustainable development goals, whether it's on the financial architecture and how it can be tweaked to benefit Africa more clearly. There's a lot of optimism that South Africa can also hope to leverage about its own domestic situation there, that we should emphasize as we move into the next year.
Great, thanks, Vincent. And yeah, you referenced the Africa Risk Reward Index that we've just quite recently published. If anyone on the call would like details of that, just ping us separately. But great, let's turn to some questions that we've got coming through the chat. So one from Sir James in the UK. What is, and we've chatted about Russia or mentioned it a few times, but what do we feel Russia's capacity for continued influence across Africa looks like, and how might this be negated?
So I can take that one. I think it shouldn't be overblown is probably the first step. There's a lot has been made of Russia's influence and disruption in the region. We still think that the capacity of Russia to really affect change in the region is limited, just for reasons to do with limited manpower, limited resources, and the fact that the continent also for Russia is not a strategic priority relative to what's going on in Eastern Europe. We see this very clearly, that even their success stories from the point of view of Russia, i.e. the Sahel and CAR, where they have essentially managed to drive away Western partners from these countries, hasn't really been followed by a lot very tangible. We're not seeing a lot of on-the-ground footprint. We're not seeing a lot of investment. If anything, in the last few months, we're seeing signs of a bit of a disengagement again of Russia from these countries. And what we hear is that they are slightly, nascent efforts from these countries to normalize relations with the West and keep a bit of a balance. So sure, Russia can still play a disruptive role, particularly if you are a Western company or a Western government in a sensitive region, there is an element of information or battle over information control that is playing out beyond these countries, and we've seen some attempts at building the same disinformation capabilities in other countries in the region. But as I said, these are relatively minor and so far relatively unsuccessful efforts. So what can be done to negate them is primarily around the the information space and supporting fact checking and independent press that can counter some of these narratives that are being propagated by Moscow. And then from the point of view of Western countries, we see them being more successful when they remain engaged and refraining from very quite knee-jerk condemnation of countries for taking ties with Russia. There is a more and more recognition that the global South is continuing and is going to continue to nurture ties with countries irrespective, and that condemning them for that basically doesn't help at all in countering their influence.
Great. No, very, very detailed response. Thanks. Thanks, Vincent. I certainly want to watch. Question now from Faud in Dubai. So you have this sort of US disengagement, which clearly we're seeing, or we will continue to see, which is coupled with a sort of French and specifically Western exits from Africa. And he alluded to the Société Générale fire sale in Africa. I guess what's the extent to which we think that the GCC, so the Middle East or Asia, for example, China or India, is going to compensate for that, and how might that happen?
I would say to an extent it will. And Tom, we were both you were in Dubai, and I joined you there a few weeks ago for the UAE Africa debate that Invest Africa kindly hosted. It's clear that there is a very strong ambition on the part of the UAE and the Gulf more generally towards Africa, that they are in a position to offer financing, investment, and connectivity in a way that some of the Western players are maybe a little bit more hesitant these days. The level of their involvement will depend on sectors, and for example, in the financial sector, referring to the SocGen sale, what we have seen isn't so much new players rather than African players developing regional financial champions, which is another very interesting development that comes out of this period. On the part of Asia, and particularly China, we also see a lot more cautious approach towards the region. We've moved away from the big ticket, very expensive infrastructure projects towards something that's a lot more focused on small manufacturing investments. So some of the gaps will not necessarily be met by other foreign external players, but rather by local companies, which for them is a massive opportunity to grow in scale and develop truly regional business leaders.
Great. And I think perhaps just one more question. And I think, Vincent, you and your team across Africa are advising on a lot of energy projects, but also increasingly a lot of energy transition projects. How would you assess that sort of risk-reward balance on these particular projects within the current operating environment?
I mean, very shortly, because I know we have a few other questions, and I'm seeing a couple on Nigeria. That's probably good for Dami. On the energy transition space, I think there is massive opportunity around solar, and that's driven by just the cost of energy declining there. On the back of COP29, where not very much happened, there was still a pledge towards higher climate finance on a yearly basis, but also a separate pledge towards greater investment in energy storage and grids. Now that's an area where we see a huge need. Is not just about putting megawatts, it's also about carrying them to customers and increasingly storing them to account for variability of solar. So that's a big play for the region, and no matter the slight disruption to the climate agenda that Trump's return to the White House brings, there is still the fundamental trend of, yes, country will continue to decarbonize their energy sector, and in particular the solar and wind sector brings a lot of very attractive propositions in the region.
Great, thanks, Vincent. And yeah, look, I think we're butting up against the hour. So conscious on time, I think we'll bring the formal call to a close now. Certainly, yes, there are some other questions that we didn't get to address, and we'll capture those separately. So yeah, just really from my side to close by thanking you all on the call for your time today. Control Risks have over 30 years of experience and expertise of operating across Africa, over 300 people on the ground, working from 7 different offices on the continent. So huge amounts of institutional knowledge and experience that we bring to the bear, and yeah, very happy to discuss any of the issues that we've covered with you today as it relates to Africa or geopolitics more broadly. Just do let us know. Finally, just thanks to Dami, to Vincent, and to Claudine. As ever, hugely insightful, and I think a really good roundup of the key risks that we see playing out in the year ahead. Chantal, thank you again to Invest Africa for hosting. Good luck with your investor mission to Morocco next week. And with that, back to you.
Thank you, Tom. I'm actually looking forward to that beautiful weather in Morocco in comparison to here mornings in London. But more so, thank you very much for your deep insights and also just your openness about risk in Africa. So thank you to you, Tom, Claudine, Dami, and Vincent. And for all the viewers, I'd really encourage you to actually make contact with Control Risks and also view on their website the risk map. And I think just on that note, as we head into 2025 as well, I would like to highlight that we're going to have our Outlook webinars, more so focus on the economic outlooks in South, West, North, and East Africa, mid-January. So do join us then. But until then, for now, goodbye and thank you very much, everyone.